These women served their country in the military to protect and defend it. But they say no one protected them.
He pulled me into the bushes and pulled my clothes off, and he said, "If you make any noise, I will hurt you very badly."
The one man that raped me in his home told everyone on the flight line what a good piece of ass I was. And so then I was embarrassed that these other men thought that I had consented to this.
Between the base and his family's place, he raped me in the car. He was an instructor at the school. I was a virgin, and I'd never even been out on a date.
Primetime spoke to these women veterans in Eugene, Oregon, to this veterans group in Denver, and to women who are protesting even now about rapes and sexual assaults that occurred far more recently.
Sex offenders! Sex offenders!
Why are so many women stepping forward today? One reason seems to be reports of sexual assault in the Persian Gulf during Operation Desert Storm. 40,000 women served in the Persian Gulf. 4 women were killed in action. 2 were prisoners of war. And 24 women reported some form of sexual assault from men wearing the same uniform. One of them was Jacqueline Ortiz, a mechanic in Delta Company, 52nd Engineer Battalion.
It happened January the 19th. It was 10 o'clock in the morning. It was the second day after the war had started.
Ortiz says her first sergeant, this man, David Martinez, called her into his desert tent and sodomized her orally.
I would have rather been killed by a bullet than to have suffered what I have suffered.
Ortiz, a divorced woman who now lives with her parents and young son in New Mexico, says she reported the incident. And that's when she says she was victimized a second time by investigators from the Army's Criminal Investigation Command.
He made me repeat the story over and over like he was perverted, like he enjoyed listening to what I had to say. When we finished, he said, "We can change your story."
And when he said, "You can change your story," what did you take that to mean?
No one ever has to hear about it.
Ortiz says for weeks she was refused medical attention, told she wasn't allowed to call home, and put on permanent guard duty.
I would read my Bible. The only book that I could read was John chapter 14. "Ye shall ask anything in my name, I will do it." And I would read that over and over just to know that there was hope and that I was going to get out of there in one piece.
Ortiz was given a polygraph test, which she was told she'd failed. She was eventually sent to a hospital in Germany, where the Army admits it lost her hospital records. Last November, after she'd gotten home, the Army closed its investigation.
And what was the Army's conclusion?
That it was consensual.
What's more, last November, Ortiz and Sergeant Martinez were each sent letters of reprimand for sexual improprieties. But Jacqueline Ortiz refused to give up. She called her congressman. She called over 50 attorneys. And finally, the Army reopened the investigation, which resulted in a confession from Sergeant Martinez. He's now being court-martialed.
Excuse me, Mr. Martinez. No comment. Is it true that you confessed to sexually assaulting Jacqueline Ortiz? Do you have any comment at all?
Martinez has not entered a plea yet, but on Monday, his lawyers filed a motion to suppress his confession, which they say was coerced.
What do you think ought to happen to Sergeant Martinez?
What the people or the court decides what he deserves, then that's what he deserves.
Last May, the Army decided Jacqueline Ortiz deserved an official letter of apology. There are 209,000 women on active duty whose records eventually wind up here at the Pentagon. That's about 11% of the force. And how many of them report they've been raped? And how many rape convictions are there in the services? Would it surprise you to learn that the Department of Defense has no idea? Gary Warner, military writer for the Orange County Register, has been investigating rape in the military for a year.
The Pentagon tells me, the Army, the Air Force, the Navy, and the Marines tell me that they're in Washington, D.C. They don't know how many people they have in jail right now for rape.
It turns out that the Department of Defense doesn't collect uniform data on sex crimes, and the various services collect it in different ways. For instance, the Army and the Air Force collect rape claim figures only on claims that are substantiated. The Navy can't tell you how many men accused by female sailors are fellow servicemen and how many are civilians. And none of the services can tell you how many convictions stemming from a complaint of rape they've had, except for the Marines. This despite the fact that in 1989, the Congress ordered the Defense Department to collect uniform numbers. We ask Assistant Secretary of Defense for Force Management and Personnel, Christopher Jane, about this.
Can you tell me how many cases there are every year in the military?
Sam, we don't have a uniform crime reporting system within the Department of Defense.
Why not?
So the problem has been that it has been very difficult to, in fact, develop such a system.
I don't think people can understand why this country can mobilize as it did in the Persian Gulf in just a few months, move 540,000 service personnel, mount that offensive. But in 3 years, you tell me you can't develop statistical information about rapes.
We have not been able to develop a uniform system for reporting crimes.
Mr. Secretary,
it's not just rape, it's all crime.
You know what that really communicates? Is that Central Command doesn't care.
Representative Patricia Schroeder is a senior member of the House Armed Services Committee who's been bugging the Pentagon about this for years.
Central Command collects data on everything it cares about. How many widgets you bought, you know, how many magazines go through the PX, anything they want, they've got numbers on.
Pentagon officials say they're working hard to change the good old boy attitudes women veterans say they had to face.
I created the story. It was fictitious.
They always used to say, don't pass your dirty laundry on.
In order to cover up their behavior, these men closed ranks.
But if anyone thinks it's all changed, look what's been happening recently in the Air Force. Charles McDowell, a civilian special investigator for the Air Force, has been conducting rape seminars for law officers in which he teaches that an astounding 50 to 60% of all rape claims are false. Moreover, McDowell has developed a checklist of 57 indications he says help determine whether a woman is telling the truth. For instance, if a victim has a history of financial problems, she gets points against her credibility. If the victim has difficulty in describing the sexual details of the assault, still more points. And if the victim describes the assault in flat, unemotional terms, more points against her credibility. Now get this, the best she can do if she does everything right and gets no points marked against her is to have her story still judged as equivocal. That is, her story is still suspect. More than 15 points and her credibility is in tatters.
Would have handled probably over 7,000 investigations in that period of time.
Detective Lieutenant Richard Marcus, who until his retirement headed the Manhattan Sex Crime Squad for 5 years, is horrified by McDowell's checklist.
Yeah, let me tell you, if they've used this procedure, it sets back sex crime investigative techniques about 30 years. Here's one question. Does the victim have difficulty in describing the sexual details of the assault? And if the victim has difficulty, according to the scale, they get 3 points.
Well, what's been your experience? Do some victims have difficulty in describing the sexual details?
Most victims have difficulty. Some can, and some can't, ultimately. Their premise is that the woman is lying if they're using this kind of thing. So let's get it over with as quickly as possible so we can get on to other things.
Would you have allowed a checklist like this to be used in your division?
Never.
Last week, Air Force brass was summoned to Capitol Hill by Congresswoman Schroeder to explain the use of this checklist.
You go in and file on a rape or a sexual assault charge, and they start questioning you. And here it is, 57 questions laid out, with the presumption that you probably made it up.
And how did the Air Force defend it? When they left Schroeder's office, Air Force Information Chief Major General J.W. Kelly didn't even try.
Does the Air Force really believe that Mr. McDowell's questionnaire can tell when a woman is lying about rape?
I'm not that detailed familiar with Mr. McDowell's questionnaire, Mr. Donaldson, but I can tell you what he did was not Air Force policy.
Well, he was operating in the name, we thought, of the Air Force when he was going around holding these seminars.
He was up there on official business, paid for by the Department of the Air Force, that's right. We now, having been made aware of that by Congresswoman Schroeder, have appreciated that, which we were just telling her, and we're going to take action to bring it to an end.
General, have you seen some of the questions on his questionnaire?
I've seen some of them.
I mean, one of them is, did the alleged victim speak in a flat, unemotional voice in relating the incident? And if the answer was yes, he said that was an indication that she was lying.
It's hard for me to believe, too, Sam. I think to describe the matter right now, I'd say it's embarrassing.
We wondered what the checklist author, Charles McDowell, had to say.
May I speak to you just a moment about your rape claim questionnaire?
I'm afraid I'm not at liberty to talk about that right now.
Why is that?
Well, this matter is currently being dealt with by proper authorities, and I'm just not at liberty to discuss it.
Do you really believe that 50 to 60% of all rape claims are false?
Going to see you Thursday night?
Well, we'd like to see you Thursday night.
I've got some people I need to see here.
So what can happen when investigators begin with the premise that the woman is probably lying? Ask Carla Kirkpatrick, a military wife who in 1985 reported an attempted rape at Elmendorf Air Force Base, Alaska, during a gynecological examination by a doctor, Lieutenant Colonel Kenneth Ake.
I propped myself up on the elbows and pushed myself up, and I looked down, and he's standing at the end of the table.
And what Kirkpatrick said she saw was the doctor exposing himself. She fled the room, became hysterical, and reported the incident to the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, OSI.
I cannot decide which has been worse, the incident with Dr. Ake or the incident with OSI.
Investigators interrogated Kirkpatrick for hours and gave her a polygraph test, which they told her she failed. By the time it was over, she was persuaded to recant her story, which she did in writing.
I was ready to go, and I could not leave that room until I signed that paper.
After the devastating Air Force investigation, Carla Kirkpatrick went home and went about her business. And so did Dr. Ake, for years.
In June 1991, Dr. Ake pled guilty to raping 5 of his patients.
Valerie Van Brocklin is the Assistant Attorney General in Alaska who prosecuted Dr. Ake long after he left the military. And guess what?
He confessed in corroborating detail to Carla Kirkpatrick's report.
The original report the Air Force convinced her to take back. At his sentencing last year, Dr. Ake apologized to his victims.
I feel horrible that 5 women after me were raped. And I think, and I can only think that if they had handled it properly, that maybe it wouldn't have been 5 women. Maybe it wouldn't have been any of them at all.
You may have noticed that both Jacqueline Ortiz and Carla Kirkpatrick were given lie detector tests, which they were told they failed. Yet, both women were eventually believed. So, what is the Department of Defense's position on the use of the polygraph in such cases? Assistant Secretary Jane.
Should a woman who claims rape be given a lie detector test, a polygraph test?
No. Women are the victims in rape cases, not the criminals.
Progress. But it'll take far more to convince women it's a new day in the military.
I hoped it would change. I hoped that more women that came in, it would change, and it hasn't changed. And that's why I'm saying now it's enough. Women don't have to put up with this anymore.